will say a French seam is my favorite seam. It's beautiful. It's a very couture finish. It takes a little bit longer to sew than just doing a regular seam, but if you don't have a serger, it's basically the seam you're probably going to end up using the most. It's ideal for finer fabrics, and I would say like cotton as well works well with the French seam. But if you end up using something like denim or anything a little bit thicker, I probably recommend going to a flat fell seam because it's better able to deal with the bulk. So let's do our French seam first. So I've just got this lightweight cotton. And what I'm going to do, just so we're not confused, there is a right side and wrong side of this fabric, but I'm just going to mark it for us so we don't get confused. So this is the right side. And here's the right side. Okay, now unlike a traditional seam, so the seams we did in the earlier video, we were sewing with the fabric right sides together. French seam is reversed, and it'll make sense why in a minute, but you actually want to sew wrong sides together, okay? So the right sides are on the outside, so wrong sides of the fabric are touching. I'm just going to pin this. And now I'm going to go sew this seam at the machine, but I'm not going to sew it at 5/8. I'm going to sew it at 3/8. This will make sense once I go through the whole process with you. Okay, so I'm back at my machine, and I'm going to sew this at 3/8. So before I was lining up my stitch with the 5/8 mark, but I don't need quite that much, so I'm actually going to do it at 3/8 right here. So I'm dropping my needle, starting a little bit in. I'm pulling out this pin since I don't need it anymore. Press her foot down, and I'm just going to go and sew at 3/8. Okay, so I've just gone and sewn that seam at 3/8. Now before I can do anything else, I actually have to trim this down, because what's going to end up happening is we're going to wrap the fabric around that seam and stitch it again, and that's what encloses everything. But before we can get there, we have to trim this seam down. So what I like to do, because the next pass of stitching we're going to do at 1/4 inch, so if we did 1/4 inch right now, we would still have fabric sticking out. So what I like to do is basically just cut this seam in half. So I'm just going to use my scissors, and I'm going to cut, I better use these guys. Just going to cut halfway down that seam, like basically a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. And now there's a few things you could do. You could try to press the seam open, but that's an extra step. You don't have to. What I prefer to do is to just press it to one side. And then fold the fabric over and along that seam, and now press it flat. Okay, so remember, we stitched with right sides together. That was the seam. We sewed at 3/8. We trimmed it about in half, pressed it to one side, and then pressed it flat. And now we're looking at the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so I'm just going to mark that wrong side. And now we're going to go to the machine and stitch the length of this seam at 1/4 inch. And as you're going to see, it's going to completely conceal that raw edge. So I'm back at the machine. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with the 1/4 inch mark. Whoop, I'm on reverse here. Whoop, there we go. So I guess we don't have to reverse. Okay, so I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch. And again, I'm looking at the mark. I'm not looking at the needle. And I'll backstitch at the end. Okay, and then press your foot up, trim. Okay, so we're back at the pressing station. I've just gone and sewn this seam at 1/4 inch, and look what happens. When I press it open, you can't see that raw edge. But by sewing it at 3/8, trimming it down, and then sewing it at 1/4 inch, that equals 5/8. So that was the total width of our seam allowance. We just kind of broke it up and sewed it in 2 stages. And now, I'll just give this a final press with the seam being pressed in whatever direction it needs to be pressed in. And you just have this absolutely beautiful seam finish where it's completely enclosed. And I really suggest mastering this French seam. Like I said, it's a couple extra steps. You have to do a little bit of extra pressing. But as you can see with a garment like this dress, it's utterly, the entire thing has a clean finish. It's so beautiful. You could wash this 100 times. It's never going to unravel. The insides look as beautiful as the outsides. And frankly, like, not even high-end designers. I mean, if you go shop in New York and go on Fifth Avenue and buy, Stella McCartney, they're not necessarily doing French seams. You'll see serged finishes in those garments. So this is like a special, thing that you do for yourself so that you make a beautiful garment that looks as beautiful on the outside as it is, or as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside.